I'm Raghav. I'm the editor for Lawyers Club India, which is the oldest and the largest knowledge sharing platform for the legal fraternity. And today we have NoRapeIndia with us, and this is the third webinar in series that we are doing with NoRapeIndia. Before this, we've had two webinars, one on POSH and one on sensitization of children and parents towards sexual crimes. And you can find those webinars on our YouTube channels, NoRape India and Lawyers Club India. NoRape India is a citizens movement which is genuinely working towards making safe environments and making people sensitized towards sexual crimes in our society. Today's topic is a very important one for everyone because we have all grown through our childhood, and we all have one part of our personality which we carry with us and which has been affected by the episodes in our childhood, and we may or may not get out of it. We might not be able to escape out of it, and we have to carry it throughout our life, which might limit us in many aspects. We might have to let go of many opportunities, and we might have many different kinds of effects on us. So just today I was reading an article that in India parents abuse their children in 30 different ways, which varies from physical. It might be burning, it might be pinching, it might be slapping and hitting, it might be mental, that is abusing, and it might be even verbal, and there's all kind of discrimination and everything that is going on. And so today's topic is very important for everyone to participate in and learn, and to find this thing growing and reaching to all of us, or all the people in your network. And we need this to get into these schools, into the mindsets of parents, into children. And we have a panel of field specialists in various fields, and we'll be talking about all the aspects from parenting, from schooling, from complaining about. Now I'll give it over to Kaveree Bamzai, who's an eminent author and journalist, and we shall start with the discussion. Thank you all for joining. Please stay tuned.
Thank you so much, Raghav. It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here with an eminent panel. I'd like to introduce them. There's Upneet Lalli. She's a stress management expert. There's Kanak Gupta, director of the Jaipuria Group of Schools, also the parent of a 10-year-old girl. There's Ashok GV, advocate of child rights voice. There's Vishnu Karthik, school leader, director of the Heritage Group of Schools, and Lata Vaidyanathan, who I think a lot of people know, have also possibly had as principal. She's a veteran educationist. So I'd like to begin with Lata ji first. The topic today is the theory and practice of POCSO. What are the gaps in theory and practice that you have seen over the years, Lata ji? Is Lata ji online?
I think a mic's on mute.
Can we begin with you, Vishnu? As someone who's been principal of a school as well, and who's been, okay, sorry. I just tossed the question to Vishnu right away, then I'll come back to you, Lata ji.
No problem.
As someone who's been a principal and now is a school leader, Vishnu, what are the gaps that you've seen with POCSO in theory and practice, and how can we fix them? Vishnu, can you hear me?
I'm not able to speak. It's unmuted.
Okay. I think then I'll begin with Lata ji.
You hear me now?
Yeah, I can. Okay.
Okay.
You hear me now?
I'll ask Lata ji to take over. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kaveree, and hi and good evening to everybody. having been an educator and having raised generations of students,
Yeah.
I would resist from commenting on the state of children and their vulnerability. However, as a school leader, I need to tell you that the primary business of all our schools is to educate children for life and living.
Right.
But even as we go into that format, we understand that we will put curriculums on the side and begin by making sure that the child's communication and everything that is associated with it is dealt with compassion, and we look at the values and the value systems and make sure that, by and large, the aspect of living is as important to us as life itself. But let me look at the child's safety, which is the focus of today's discussion, and POCSO Act in particular. And I would like to say that ever since it came into being in 2012, we have had a real good hand-holding, and I think a great support in the whole process. But even as I say that, I think, and it's also been mandated by the board that we have a POCSO committee in school and follow the norms as guidance for it. But by and large, because of the mandate and because of the imposition by the state agencies, a lot of schools have the POCSO committee in place, but how it functions is the most important thing. However, the fact that the committee is in place and it's suitably represented by all stakeholders in the process gives us a strong feeling that we can deal with any problem. And of course, the problem is on prevention, it's on prohibition and redressal, as they say. But in doing so, I think our primary business is to make sure that we have all our child safety policies in place. And if we say we have child policies in place, then of course there are three major factors that would go with it. Essentially the process, the people, and the purpose. And if we say this and try and see how we have put our safety policies in place, then I think there's a whole list of pointers that we can look into, which really serves the purpose. And the business of the school, by and large, is basically prevention. And that is the area I'd like to really focus on. So as a school, the primary infrastructure of the place has to be all right, in the sense that we have well-lit classrooms, well-lit corridors, transport, and all other places in the school with active camera surveillance. And we also can see that if all this is in place, then the school's ERP can also trace the children on where they are and what they are. Well, this is the support that we expect schools to have in order that, the whole process is supported by the infrastructure itself. Then, of course, one of the areas that really takes the beating is the school counseling department as such. Yes. We have all the departments in school, but the counseling department in most of the schools, now, of course, much better than it was before, is rather weak. And we look at the whole system and we say that there is just one counselor for about 2,000 children in most of the schools. And that also, therefore, the pressure on her is so much that good policies and practices are never able to be followed. So in an ideal situation, if we have a department where people and their roles are clearly defined, as in having special educators, behavioral counselors, psychological counselors, and also career counselors and counselors library for reference, then I think it would be a much better department.
Vishnu, may I just bring, sorry. Vishnu,
just a moment. I just want to say here that, if all of this is in place,
yes,
then there are other things that we need to put in place and get the whole lot of training that is required for both the teachers and the counselors to be in place so that any of this can be avoided.
Wonderful. A great way to begin. I'd like to bring in Vishnu here and take off from this point that the fact is that all this should be there, but it often isn't. And what is there instead is an increasingly adversarial relationship between the parent and the school, and the child sort of caught in between this relationship. So the primary concern being of the child, what really happens there? Vishnu, can you
Yes,
hear me?
yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Sorry for the technical glitch. I hope
no.
you can hear me now.
Yeah, we can.
Sorry for the question. You're very right. The primary role of an educator or a school institution is the protect the interest of the child. In fact, that would trump even more what the law states us.
Yeah.
So as a school leader, I would say I would abide by all the law which is this land demands. But as an educator, I would always take a call of what's important for the child and not necessarily what is legally permissible. And often there is a difference between these two issues. One of the primary reasons for this gulf is the relationship between the parent and the school institution. Often schools focus on a lot on rigor, but not necessarily on relationships. I often say schools which focus on relationships as the primary reason of existence, between the relationship between children, relationship between parents, a lot of the prevention can happen. Schools which do not have a healthy relationship, schools which do not invest in the relationship with parents, may lead to some of the differences which Kaveree you just pointed out. So hence it is extremely critical that schools, right from day one when they join in, start working with parents to help them understand, one, what is child protection, what a child rights is, educate them about what is happening in the world of safe bringing up of a child, enlighten them of the provisions of the law, what the law can do and can't do. If these initiatives are taken by the school, largely parents do start creating a sense of trust with the school. When the trust is not there, of course, there is an adversarial relationship between the parent and the school, and often the child is the
victim
of that relationship.
And a double victim in a way.
Double victim.
Kanak, I'd like to bring you in here because you run this group of schools, and as you had said earlier, in a lot of tier 2 and tier 3 cities, where parents often don't want these discussions. Parents are the first people to say that, let's not go there. My child is, knows enough, or, this is not what we want our child to know. That becomes a big issue, isn't it? Because sex education is really something that schools don't want to necessarily always consider.
So, Kaveree, you're right. And yeah, we are running schools in tiers, and there is a lot of resistance that comes from parents. As a parent myself, and my daughter is fairly young, for me, it was a learning curve, and that I think as an educator, I've brought it home, and I'm from home, I've taken it to work as well, that what is important. And we developed a framework because we said that if we need our children protected, which I think is most important, as Lata and Vishnu were both saying, if we need to educate our parents, because it's a generation where there was a stigma with sex ed, and our teachers are also not very comfortable talking about it. So we developed a framework. We started saying that, let's make it very natural to talk about this, because these are natural things. Then we said that we need to have empathy, because if a child would suffer, unfortunately, you would need to have empathy with the process. You don't want to look only at the legal aspect of it. You need to be fast with it. They just wait on it, sit on it. So there was speed. And then there needs to be transparency, because, there is a witch hunt that goes behind a lot of the decisions that come out. So we did not want that to happen with the children, because the interest of the child becomes paramount important. The places where we work, the parents would always resist. The parents would always say that we do not want any kind of sex ed happening for our children. We do not want any kind of CCTV cameras in the corridors or in the classroom. We are happy with the way it is. And they would actually reach out to the teachers and complain about it. And we said that instead of first going with our children's training and our children's familiarization of the act and good touch and bad touch, let us also bring in parents into the fold. And whenever we would have mass PTMs and we would have the orientation programs, we would talk about these issues. And parents slightly after resistance have now started warming up to it, that this is important, because a lot of cases get highlighted in the media as well. So we feel that, you know, a change is happening. It needs to be more rapid. It needs to be more structured, and that's what we are doing.
Yeah, Dr. Lalli, I'd like to bring you in here, because the fact is that we do not have enough trained counselors. I mean, we may talk about departments of counselors, but most schools barely have even one trained counselor. So how do we handle this issue of having trained counselors and having enough of them? Dr. Lalli?
Good evening, everyone. Yeah. There are, certain aspects about children's rights and child rights issues being neglected. We have about 40% of our population consists of children, and 40% of them have been abused. So it's a mind-boggling figure if you think in terms of numbers.
Right.
And if you think in terms of the number of psychiatric facilities available and the number of counselors available, that's much less. And I think the whole emphasis of our education system has been more on academic achievement, yes, rather than in terms of equipping our children to deal with life situations and give them life skills.
Right.
And the focus has to reorient itself, and we can come up with the more deterrent laws, but it just will not work. It has to start with prevention, and we need to have a special focus, even in psychology departments, on counseling children and on different issues, let's say on dealing with learning disabilities, dealing with abuse issues, dealing with neglect and violence. All those aspects have to be taken care of. And this is where I guess, many schools say we have just one counselor, and that's even in the so-called elite schools.
Right.
So this is something that the parents and the school authorities and the Department of Education and MHRD, they have to focus on, is that if you have children being counseled and that facility being available to them, they will be better able to cope up with the situations. Because I have seen, children who have grown into adults who have been abused, the trauma stays throughout life. Yeah. And even at the university level, and then you find that its repercussions are there throughout the life as such. So the right intervention at the right point of time is something that's extremely important. Counseling, I think, of parents is equally important. Yes. It's not just of the children. As a counselor, we would say that it's the parents who require counseling.
Yeah.
And any incident of child abuse that gets highlighted in the media, that's the point that the school authorities can take up with the parents of the children, that this is the situation. I recall one case in Chandigarh city where a child who had, the mother noticed that this child was crying after getting down from the bus. And it so happened that the conductor of the bus had abused the child.
Oh.
So this was a point where, and we say in school, the first person to notice, the child spends about 6 hours or 7 hours in the school. The first person to notice that something is wrong with the child is either someone at home or someone in school, that is the teacher.
Right.
So how do you observe the signs and symptoms of abuse, let's say? How do you spot vulnerable children? And if the counselors are trained on those aspects, it would be really good in terms of nipping and in terms of intervention that will be required in the first instance.
Absolutely. But of course, again, we're talking of an ideal situation where classroom sizes are small and teachers have time to actually observe their children carefully and to see, how their behavioral pattern has changed. Ashok, I'd like to bring you in here and talk about the legal aspects of POCSO, because it's not just about children in school, it's also children out of school and, out of school hours, out of school. So what are the limitations of this act and how can we fix them?
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So now a general introduction to the law itself. So the POCSO Act traces its history to 2012, right, which is when it was actually officially brought into force.
Right.
Now, what it does is it criminalizes any kind of sexual behavior with a person below the age of 18.
Right.
So conventionally, the entire ambit of what is illegal behavior, illegal sexual behavior with a child was continuing to be determined under the Indian Penal Code. So 2012 onwards, the POCSO Act comes in, and the focus is on child protection, and the emphasis is on penalizing criminal behavior with a child. Now, in addition to that, there is also a scheme of procedures prescribed under the Act. So for the first time, we also now have a law that says if I have even whether the knowledge or the mere apprehension that a child was or is likely to be sexually abused, I am now mandatorily required by law to report the suspicion or the apprehension to the local police.
Right.
So the question, I think, is not what is the limitation of the Act, because I think the Act has no limitation. The limitation is really in terms of how do we implement such a overambitious legislation,
Right.
which kind of places such tall obligations on the entire community to kind of come together and be responsible for the child.
Right.
So based on whatever I'm hearing, all people from the education sector speak,
Yeah.
I think the emphasis really is on creating a culture and a policy around child protection itself.
Right.
When I say a culture of child protection, I mean a lot of schools already have child protection policies, but they continuously face challenges in terms of implementation. Because while the emphasis is on creating infrastructure, training of the teachers, training of the staff, but what has also not happened simultaneously is that no relationship is being built with the local police station.
Yeah.
So when the processes work and the incident is now finally coming to light and the report has to be made to the police station, you may not necessarily get the most professional or the most efficient response.
Absolutely.
So as part of the child protection policy and the culture around it, I think what needs to happen is that we need to create an ecosystem. The ecosystem has several stakeholders: the parents, the students, the teachers, the local police, the local education department. And all of these stakeholders need to jointly buy into the child protection policy, so that when the policy has to be turned into a standard operating procedure, or when an incident has to be reported, all these stakeholders can be simultaneously activated and they're trained to handle it the right kind of manner. So I think the limitation is not in terms of the law, but just in terms of the amount of creativity that is needed to take something so overambitious and then turn it into something that actually works on the ground. So I think that would probably be where the focus should lie.
What are the lessons that some of the other acts, similar acts, for instance, the Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act, what are the lessons that POCSO can learn from?
So I think there are two aspects of I think the two learnings from that we can borrow from the protection of women from sexual harassment at the workplace guidelines.
Yeah.
Is that firstly we need to look at the subject of creating a safe space in the school,
Right.
not just as an obligation towards the law,
Yeah.
but as a culture that we want to build and the culture that we want to project to our students and their parents.
Right.
So that means that we are making an active effort, as Vishnu said, as Kanak said, we need to build the right kind of relationship with the students, with the parents. So I think that relationship ensures that there is seamless communication, that there is trust, and there is the right kind of support being extended at the right kind of time. I think the second lesson that we can draw from the guidelines on the subject of sexual harassment of women at the workplace is also that independent of the criminal liability, under civil law, a campus or an educational institution has a duty not to be negligent towards the people under their duty of care.
Right.
So I think the entire genesis is essentially that the campus has an independent obligation, regardless of the law, towards the safety of both women and children on the campus. And what are the processes that they then need to put in place to avoid being held guilty of negligence? Absolutely. I think these are the two legal learnings that comes from the subject of sexual harassment of women at the workplace.
Right. Lataji, I'd like to bring you in because your experience over generations has been so immense. You've also seen the change in the sexuality of young people. People are becoming far more aware far earlier than before. So how does the school, how do the parents, how does society at large deal with youngsters today who are living in such an explosive environment?
So I think one of the very important things is to recognize this fact first and not live in denial that children are actually responding to all this and there's a whole lot of change in their bodies, even earlier maturity, which can be seen in children.
Yeah.
And it's not like our days, and we are not the only source of information. They get the information from all over. They have access to net, they have access to Google, they have access to friends, peers, and who are older than them, younger than them, of all sexes. They are seeing a whole lot of media announcements, and the way in which the children are responding to all of this. Actually, they have enough information. What they really don't know is how to deal with this information. And therefore, the schools have the responsibility to predict this and make it possible for them. So whether it's relationships, whether it's sex education, whether it is understanding their own bodies, there needs to be modules which the counselors or the counseling department, along with the teachers, you can't relegate it to one part and say only you will handle it. So I think the whole school needs to be kind of trained to handle this, along with parents. Very often parents are the ones who come and say, school se seekh kar aata hai. So I think these are some of the things that we need to take everyone, a very robust PTA, a very robust team of people, and all those concerned people, whether it is parents, teachers, and the school itself, the community at large, the management, all of them understanding this, need to make age-appropriate modules, understand this, and make this communication a little more free. Because everyone needs to understand that there's no shame in this communication. There needs to be clarity in this communication. They need to be safe. Above all, they need to be safe. And small bit of experimentation and curiosity can sometimes land them in a lot of trouble. So if we can prevent that at an early stage by building all these safeguards within the system of good communication, of ease of making this whole atmosphere, making it easy for communication, basically. Sometimes you call the parents, they don't come. Even if you identify children with difficulties, and we have identified them in schools, and I have the experience to tell you that when we call the parents, they want to hush it up. They don't, ma'am, baaton ko mat mano. Sometimes you get these responses from them. Aise hi bol raha hai. So we know that there's trouble in the home. We know there's sometimes trouble in the bus. There is trouble in the school. And our primary business is to prevent this by communication. And there's yet another beautiful way in which schools have attempted it, and it has worked. For example, assemblies, the quizzes that go with it. There are these nukkad nataks. We can do all of that. Something which cannot be said straight can be said through all this drama and dance. So I think the whole fabric has to be knitted with a focus on the child's safety, and we need to do that very carefully. And that should become a part of the policy that during the year, there will be these many events, and it's not a one-time event. We need to have it regularly at regular intervals, including all the stakeholders, to make this conversation around it safe and easy.
Vishnu, may I bring you in here and talk about, moving from crisis to crisis? Say something like the boys' locker room happens, and suddenly everyone becomes aware that, our children are sexualized at a very young age. Of course, everyone knows that, but people don't like to talk about it. So we find ourselves moving from one crisis to another without really developing an overarching infrastructure, social or otherwise, to tackle this. So what do you have to say about that, Vishnu?
So, Kaveree, I have a contrary view on this.
Yeah.
For every one news which comes in, one piece of news which comes in the media, attracts the space of the society, there are 100 other cases which have been wonderfully resolved. I know educators, lawyers, counselors working in this field would agree to this. I have seen cases which have wonderfully been resolved, the child being rehabilitated. It's just not the victim. By the way, when any abuse happens, the victim is not just the victim involved. It is also the community which pays a price. Yeah. Often the bully is a bigger victim than the bully in some cases.
Right.
Let's say if there are two children involved and one of the child is a victim, another child is an abuser, there is hurt which the entire community pays. And I've seen great healing happening in my last 10, 12 years, not just in my community, but in several other schools too. So I just want to caution folks in this platform, don't get carried away by what media puts as news, as what you read on WhatsApp. for every one bad news you see, there are 100 beautiful cases which has happened, which is not to say that abuse doesn't happen. All I'm saying is there are greater possibilities today of resolving them beautifully. So I just want to put that. Second, you're right, Kaveree, that we do move crisis to crisis. I often feel generally as a society, we are ever hurried, but with no sense of urgency. We're ever doing last minute, we're ever in a hurry to do things, to immediately react, but you really don't respond. We really don't have a sense of urgency to some of the larger issues. Great school communities don't move crisis to crisis. They predict and prevent. They create the right ecosystem, they create the right relationship, they create the right spaces to have these conversations. More importantly, they create the right rituals. You know, some of these things, the power of the rituals play a big role in diffusing and empowering community members to tackle these issues. And great school communities.
What do you mean by that, Vishnu? What do you mean by that?
See, one of the challenges of this is not a content. It's not like sex education, dikha diya, everybody understood it. It doesn't work like that. It is not a content. It's an act. Let's recognize this. All of us are working in a compulsion of what is available in the society. We're all products of society. No one person or one family can be blamed for what has happened. It is a byproduct of several things. It could even undercurrents of the socio-economic structures, the caste structures, the power struggles, the stereotypes and conditioning which has happened for generation after generation. We're all a byproduct of this. The only way you can tackle these is to having conversations where the hidden perspectives are brought out. Of course, you show them content, you show them you help them understand the law, but that doesn't empower them fully to have those honest conversations. Doesn't empower them to fully express what they are feeling. Right? Rituals are a powerful way to unlock them. So rituals could be a crew seating or a crew work in the morning, a circle time in the morning. Lata talked about assemblies. You break those assemblies also in a more intimate setting. Traditional assemblies are kids stand, there is a skit put up, there are 1,000 kids standing and a few people performing. There are more innovative ways where you can intimately create some conversations, to having safe conversations, in fact. One of the things we do in our community is called Samvad, which is a residential program every year for about 4 days, starting grade 6 to grade 12, where we do explore themes around caste system, privilege, sex, even skin color. You know, one of the things which happens especially in this part of the country, is the skin color itself. You'll be amazed how young kids, middle school kids, by the way, the worst form of bullying happens not in the senior school, it is middle school, grade 6. It's the worst. And this has got nothing to do with India. Across geographies, you'll find grade 6 to 8. It's an evolutionary gift. It's an evolutionary gift for us to form into groupism. We're still figuring out our place in the social hierarchy. We are still social animals. It's an evolutionary gift. We just need to figure out ways for kids to manage that, what's happening in their brains. But some of these things are broken only when you have meaningful rituals and games in it. And especially in our tradition, rituals are natural for us. We just have to tap into those in it and to help kids to talk about it.
Dr. Lalli, can I bring you in here and talk about the fact that while certain schools may be doing that, you don't see enough sharing between schools of best practices. And that's another issue, because schools have become so competitive in terms of academics that a lot of that has even spilled over to just how children are being educated in a holistic fashion. And that's what, often what works in one school could also be replicated elsewhere. But you don't see this kind of sharing of knowledge happening.
I'm so glad that the educationists out here are talking about what Vishnu mentioned is something which we call as restorative justice in the education sector, where you teach children in terms of resolving conflicts and in terms of also acknowledging, we find that the exposure of children is extremely great today, and a lot of that experimentation that goes on, and in terms of children realizing that what they've done. So if there is a forum, I think at each district, the schools could share their best practices, share their good practices that are there. That could be a part of a conference that takes place and the sharing of ideas that takes place. That's a good beginning that could be made. It's also something where you ask and you have the feedback being taken from all the important stakeholders, from the children and from the parents as well as from the others, that this is what has worked for us and this is where we could do better. So it's not just being critical, but this is something that we could do better. And I think here is an opportune time as well, that it could be something that enables schools to work along. And I'm so happy. Another way that I train the police officers, and what I then that the education sector doesn't realize the importance, like we are on one end of the spectrum. And so that multi-sectoral approach that is needed is something that hand-holding will be required with the Department of Social Welfare, with the Department of Education, with the Police Department, with the Child Welfare Committee. And I'm focusing on the law because being a law student, I also realized that the Child Welfare Committee has a very, very important role to play in the welfare of children. And I don't know how much of it, because across the country, I've seen there are different levels of how the members of the CWC have responded in terms of the problems of child rights violations, be it in schools or outside the schools. And the CWC has a very important and a critical role to play. Training of CWC becomes extremely important for this aspect. That is a committee that could actually be sharing all the good practices, calling all the schools and being the fulcrum point for enabling schools to know what is good and what in terms of policy is working or not.
Ashok, so I think, can I bring, Ashok, can I bring you in here and talk about some of the most challenging case studies you've seen recently and what are the learnings from there?
Okay, so I unfortunately don't have the best of news to provide, because my profession brings me into the picture only when things have really escalated, right? So, I mean, see, I have dealt with quite a few cases where I've represented children or continue to consult with children who have been victimized on campus. And the responses have been less than ideal for more than a few reasons. So first and foremost, the inherent challenge with any kind of sexual violence against children is that the reporting may not always happen in a very timely fashion. Right. So oftentimes the child has been victimized. There is a lapse of a considerable amount of time before the social circle around the child is made aware of the fact that the child was victimized. So late reporting already places the challenge of prosecuting investigation and prosecution that much more significant. Now, in addition to that, what also happens is that the psychology of the average Indian, it works very it works very differently across different places. So on one hand, there is a consistent resistance towards the subject of sex education, towards conversations involving safe touch, unsafe touch, sex and sexuality. But on the other hand, if there is, God forbid, an incident on campus, the reaction can sometimes be as extreme as a massive smear campaign against the school. Sometimes even physical scuffles involving teachers. So it's very difficult to really anticipate some of these extremities that we see. So what happens is, in a culture that is as chaotic and in a system that is as unaccustomed to these kind of cases, the moment an incident is brought to light, there is panic across the spectrum, right? So the police are panicking because they are scared that somebody's going to come and say you didn't do enough to prevent this. The parents are panicking because somewhere they feel very guilty that they did not somehow anticipate and prevent the child from going through this. The school is feeling extremely vulnerable because on one hand they failed to protect the child, and on the other hand there is this massive PR crisis that they're staring at, which could potentially derail all the noble initiatives that they have in mind. So in a situation like this, when things are as chaotic and things are as driven by a fear psychosis, what happens is that the response is never professional, and it is always all the wrong ideas tend to be the first idea. So in our experiences, what happens is that the school ends up seeing this as a question on their credibility and their systems and processes. So they more often than not, in at least the cases that we have dealt with, end up trying to offer legal representation to the accused, trying to offer as minimal cooperation with the investigation authorities as is possible. There have been even instances when the child was convinced by some of the principals and the teachers around that the child may have even imagined the whole incident. So the consistent effort made to kind of undermine the child is, I don't think it is based on anything malified. I don't think the idea is to really take away the pain of the victim, but the idea is to just act out a certain fear psychosis that is so pervasive. So being able to prepare for some of these situations, like how we have fire safety protocols where we are training for it, where there are rituals around it, as Vishnu said, which is a very beautiful point. I think even on the subject of safety and privacy of the child, which is how do we preserve the autonomy, integrity, and boundaries of the child, there must be a culture, a thinking, and a day-to-day approach, behind it. Otherwise, as I said, in a state of panic, the worst idea is almost always the first idea that translates into action.
Yeah.
So I really hope, I'm very heartened to see the schools have made such fine and such rational and such consistent efforts, because our experience as lawyers for victims have very seldom exposed us to the better way of looking and addressing these kind of subjects.
Vishnu, can I bring you in here and talk about what parents can do? And if you have any interesting case study to tell us what can be done?
Okay, these are two different questions. I can probably break into two parts. First, about a case study. So I just want one of the jobs of an educator, and I know the compulsions of Ashok and folks on the ground, and I'm not taking away from the reality of what they are facing. And we do come across as very grievous cases. It is, in fact, worst cases actually don't reach Ashok. I should also tell you that. It just gets buried. But I recognize and empathize with the compulsion what Ashok had shared. But I also, what I'm sharing is, I think society is also maturing. School communities are also evolving thanks to the work of the lawyers and advocates and counselors on the ground. That they're also getting better equipped to handle this. The case in point is that many years back in one of the schools in Gurgaon where I was asked to consult, there's a case of there's a relationship between a young boy and a young girl, both of them in their middle school, and they were in a relationship. And it happens often in a relationship when it happens, the girl, in the interest of wanting to be more accepted by the boy, started sharing intimate pictures, and some of these pictures were sexually explicit, and the boy, like a not a typical teenager, but a boy who had a gang of friends who want to be popular, and his friends share those pictures. Right. By the way, this is very, very common.
Yeah.
Possibly 1 in a million reaches the attention. By the way, boy stalker is not the worst, which is a much worse thing.
Much worse.
Yeah. So boy stalker is just an exciting thing which the media got caught up to. Those are normal experiences of what educators go through. And actually, it's even worse if we go abroad in some of these public schools in the US, for example. In any case, so in this case, which happened, and a lot of the boys in the school had access to the pictures of this particular girl. And you could imagine it, it's a loss of social status. One, of course, it comes under POCSO. A child's individual rights have been infringed upon. And two, forget about the law, but imagine what's going to happen to this girl child. Those pictures have been gone all out, and all the students have seen those pictures. Right. And what was her standing in it? As a teenager, it was devastating. What is more devastating was the parents were broken. This was a single child. Both the father and mother came. The mother felt that this is the end of the world for her, because you also start imagining that these pictures don't disappear from the internet. And that's also the reality of today's age and time. In those days, when you take a picture, it gets printed, you can wipe out printed images.
You can't do that anymore.
The digital world, it has its own life. And of course, there naturally this one. And it became a sense of doom for parents. In fact, that school had to work a lot with the parents first and tell them, hey, this is not the end of the world, come on. Your job right now is to give confidence to your daughter. And of course, we followed, the school followed through the procedure. But one of the things we wanted to do was, what happens to those boys who actually indulged in this? Some of the one of these two boys would have done with the intent to malign this girl child. But the passive fence sitters, a lot of them have just been sitting, they're passive consumers of this content. They knew it was wrong, but they still didn't raise a voice.
Yeah.
We really want to heal that and talk about it. And then we had a series of conversations with this girl child and asked her, what do you want to do? And with the help of the parents, the girl child, the counselor, and of course with the legal team also in charge, we designed a kind of a dialogue of this girl with the class.
Okay, how nice.
And we shut down there's no teaching happening for 1 week.
Right.
We shut down every subject, no
Right.
English, math, science. It is just these hard conversations.
Right.
And we were touched to see everybody broke down, they apologized. And the next Monday, which was an assembly, this girl went to the stage and spoke. And then all the classmates, the rest 28 of them, came up on the stage, shared their views, stood together as a class, and apologized for the behavior of what went.
How wonderful. Did the boy apologize?
Every teacher there in that assembly hall were
Right.
in tears. We were like amazed and stunned how this generation could be so matured in handling this.
Did the boy apologize?
Sorry?
Did the boy apologize?
Yeah, one of the things, and you could, I don't know what the audience is going to think of me, but I know many educators will share with this.
Yeah.
Students are students.
Yeah.
However grave and extreme the crime could be, but they are still students, they're still teenagers, their prefrontal cortex is still not evolved and developed.
Right.
They have, like Lata talked about, they have access to things which we never had access to.
Right. Right.
And it's like giving a Ferrari engine
Yeah.
brakes.
Yeah.
I really can't blame the. Of course, they paid a price. They had to move out to another school, but it went. You apply the principles of restorative justice even to these boys.
Right.
In fact, our work is not just with the girl child. Our work is with the boys who did this too.
Absolutely. That's really a wonderful, moving, example. Lata ji, can I bring you?
Sorry, Kaveree. One thing I should tell you.
Tell me.
5 years, almost last month. It's been 5 years now.
Yeah.
This girl is now in the US on a full scholarship.
Wonderful.
Me and my wife were in a restaurant for this is before the lockdown.
Right.
This girl walked up to me and I didn't recognize her. And then she said, Vishnu sir, do you recognize me? We had worked on this case together.
Wonderful.
Now you could see her. She's found her confidence. She's now moved to new geographies.
Right.
But she's come out really empowered. And she tells my wife, I think the first time my wife thought I'm doing something worthwhile in my life. I'm really glad that what the school did to me at that point in time.
Wonderful.
So I just want to talk about the victim in this case also come out really empowered through.
Yeah. Wonderful. That's really great. Lata ji, can I bring you in here and talk about any such experience you have had where you were able to turn around a case, or where, you saw a cover up happening and, it was something that that disturbed you?
Yes, I think I can share a very important happening in school, but the incident didn't happen in school.
Okay.
This was a child who was abused at home.
Okay.
And the only person she could share with was a friend.
Okay.
So one of the days when a child was on my duty at school, because it's called the principal's duty, she just walked in and said, I want to talk to you when there's nobody around. And in walks this child, the friend of this child, and says, I'm going to bring in this girl who will tell you why she's crying the whole day. So then no teacher had actually noticed her really crying, except that this friend had so much to say and she had the trust in me to walk into my office and say this to me, that such a thing has happened at home. Now, when this happens at home also, the entire focus and everything that's around the child changes. The child is guilty. She has no one to share it with, and she doesn't know how to come out of this crisis, because at home, the elders in the home tell her, well, if this has happened, make sure that you don't talk about it. It's not something you need to talk about. But this child who's living in this kind of a trauma found some way of offloading her trauma to a friend, and with the support of a friend had the guts to walk into my office. Now, having heard her case, we brought in the counselor and we had a little program for ourselves, which was managed by actually students, and that was called Chalo Baat Karte Hain. as a part of, it's a fortnightly activity which they had, and all kinds of problems that they have, which normally dealt with in that forum. But this gave some, when this child started talking about it and the counselors came in to help, all her friends got together and there was born something very beautiful. And the child came out of it because of that support. And she was among the toppers later on. But I want to say what came out of it. Came out of it a peer counseling group. Soon we realized in school that if something like this happens, they are happy to talk to their friends rather than bring it to the notice of the elders or the teachers, either at home or in school. And then the peer counseling actually started to happen in school. So we brought in Tashi and we brought in a lot of NGOs and trainers to both train the PTM as well as the student leaders who wanted to come together. And there were representatives of students from right across class 6 upwards, and all children therefore could come together and talk. So in this experience, as also together with other unfortunate incidents like this in school, which is like Vishnu mentioned about sharing photographs, about hanging out together, about night outs in different homes. So there are all these little things socially important for them, which happens. All these issues came into the peer training group. And I would think that once the peers are trained, they really support and make things happen and make it so much more easier for us to deal with it in the right way. And sometimes they deal better than us.
Right.
So that was one.
Kanak, can I bring you in here and ask you how much of the law do parents and children and the teachers really know?
So, Kaveree, what happens is, I don't think most of the parents know that this is mandatory by law. The board also mandates that, you need to have POCSO training for your teachers in school. You need to have good touch, bad touch training for the students happening at school. It is mandated by law. And I think parents should be encouraged to participate with all of this. I'm just going to come back, Kaveree, to one of the points you raised earlier. I think Ashok was talking about as to how schools need to learn from each other. And I'll share with you an example. When this whole boys locker thing came out, and it was Vishnu's school which actually came into the limelight because it was wrongly reported that it was happening at his school. The first person I actually called
He's been trying to defend him since the thing.
So the first person I actually called was Vishnu. And I asked him that, okay, hey, what's happening? And we had a talk and we discussed. And after that, Vishnu told me, and I started defending the school as well. I had nothing to do with Heritage School, but I was still defending the school. I was called on some media channel which wanted to discuss the boys' locker. And, I went on the channel and I was talking about how it is not this school. It is an unfortunate incident, but it is a small incident. There are bigger incidents at schools. Because parents are not aware of it, because we don't know how to educate our children about proper or guide them about social media, about etiquettes. We need to talk about these things. There's not always a good idea to throw the baby out with the bath water. There is always good things that are there with social media. There's always good thing with networking. And until and unless these issues come to our living rooms, until and unless we bring parents to schools and talk to them about these issues, that mindset change, that paradigm shift that we are talking about, that Lataji was talking about right in the start, is not going to happen. And for that, we mandate to the parents that, whenever there is an orientation happening, there is going to be a session on sex ed. There is going to be a session on POCSO. And it's not only us that talk about it. We get people like Ashok, like Lataji, like Vishnu on our campuses right now during lockdown. Yes, we are using technology, but we do bring in people from outside and we collaborate quite a lot, because it probably works in all geographies, but in India it works a little more that koi aur bol raha hai to wo sahi bol raha hai, lekin ghar wala jo bol raha hai wo galat hai. So it's always good to get someone from outside to speak to the parents. It's always good. So we're doing all of that. But I want to reach out to all the parents out there that yes, it is mandatory. So don't feel awkward about it when we speak to your children about it. And you should also participate in all these debates. You should participate in these training sessions. It's very, very important.
Right. Ashok, can I ask a question that's come in? what does one do if the police officer refuses to lodge the complaint? I think this happens quite often.
Yes. So, I mean, I do a fair amount of training with the police. So
Right.
there are, look, nothing in our country can be put into nice little patterns or stereotypes. I think there's for every truth, there is always a counter truth, and
Right.
both are equally real and equally, out there, right? But
Right.
yes, you are right. Refusal of registration of the FIR is quite often a problem.
Right.
Now, there are sweeping legislative changes. Now, after the Nirbhaya incident, two things happened. One, the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013 came into the picture. Now, under that, Section 166AC of the Indian Penal Code was introduced, which now makes it a criminal offense for the police officer not to follow the law when he or she is required to do something by law. So, for example, if the police officer is getting information of a cognizable offense, and most sexual offenses are considered cognizable offense, the law makes it mandatory for him to register an FIR. If he doesn't do it, independent of whether it is an offense under the POCSO Act or not, he can still be held accountable for up to 2 years of imprisonment under Section 166AC of the Indian Penal Code.
Right.
The other thing is specific to children. There is a provision of Section 21 of the POCSO Act, which actually prescribes punishment for the police officer who's receiving information of a child who has been subjected to one of those offenses.
Right.
But despite receiving that information, he is not doing what he is required to do by law. So
Right.
there is a big sword that is hanging on the necks of the policemen if they don't act in accordance with law. Right now, that is on paper. Now, in reality, the problem is not going to go away simply because you're going to show Section 21 or Section 166AC, because his instinct will be get out and do what you want. So, which is why I always talk about how it's important for us to build a relationship with the local police, right? And more often than not, and this is the stark reality out there, our touch point with the police is only when we are in some kind of a trouble.
Right.
So I think that is the first hurdle that we have to cross by actually making it a more proactive approach with the local policeman, as opposed to going to him only when there is some kind of a trouble. So for schools, for example, if you have some functions in the school, always make it a point to invite some representatives of the local police station to come and attend, right?
Right.
You can have the local inspector come and take a session on safety of children on campuses, what the police can do for students who have been victimized, what steps the police are taking to keep the campus and the surrounding area safe.
Right.
So for school day functions, have them on board, right? So I think that's one way of doing it. Now, in spite of all those relationship building measures, you're still getting a hard wall in the police station. The next step is to go up the chain in the hierarchy, which is you're not getting a favorable response from the inspector. You go to the DYSP, you go to the SP, you go to the DCP, ACP, commissioner. Somewhere up the chain of the police hierarchy, you are bound to find one place where there is bound to be one officer who says an FIR will be registered.
Right.
Now, if the other way to tackle the same problem is, instead of going to the police station, take the child to the nearest government hospital for a medical examination,
Right.
because you want to ensure that the safety and the health of the child is preserved, and any evidence related to the crime can also be preserved in the process. The moment you take the child to a government hospital and say that this is a medical legal case of a sexual assault, the doctors will immediately notify the police station that there is a case of this nature that's come to them. At that point of time, for the policeman to say, I will not register the FIR, becomes almost impossible. Right? So there are ways to tie the hands of the police. If everything else fails, you can always go to the magistrate with a complaint under Section 200 of the CRPC, and he has got all the powers to direct the police to register an FIR and start investigating.
I think, Ashok, every school will need to have you on board as a legal expert. Gaurav,
I hope I'm never required.
yeah, Gaurav, can we have some questions from the public now, please?
Yes, Kaveree. The first question is, what are the 3 basic steps which a school should adhere to the moment they know of a child abuse incident in the school? I suppose Lataji or Dr. Upneet Lalli, one of them can answer this.
Yeah. Can you just repeat that question again? What are the 3?
3 basic steps which a school should adhere to the moment they know of a child abuse incident.
Okay. I think once we know, but your question should also state whether the abuse actually happened in school.
Yes, they know of a child abuse in the school. The incident has happened in the school.
Is happened in the school. So I think the first 3 steps, because we have a POCSO committee in place, in a school. So I think the first 3 steps would be that firstly, whoever is the victim must have the courage and the support of people to have this incident reported. And this report can be somebody from either a peer or through the Student Leadership Council or through the class teacher or the counselor. And if this message comes through to the head of school that such an incident has happened, and if it comes through clearly, then I think we need to first tackle. The first 3 steps would be to make sure that the child has the confidence and feels supported that in whatever she's reporting, justice, not only justice will be done, but also that she will not be looked down upon by the community of students and others around her. So I think the first step is to make sure that she is given enough confidence by whoever is around her to report the matter to the person in whom she has the confidence. It could be a friend, a counselor, a teacher, or anybody else. Now, the second step could be that this should be brought after the first counseling happens without necessarily hurrying up through the process so that nobody feels guilty or upset about it. Once a child is comforted, then I think whoever heard it first must report it in writing to the principal concerned. It will be in the second step that the principal will be able to take a decision whether this requires any further legal handling. Should it be taken to the committee or can it be counseled and helped? Because basically our job is to prevent and counsel and put people at ease. But in the whole process, the perpetrator of the crime should not be let off. Therefore, this will have to go through. Once all this is at ease, then I think without delay of the legal process that's required, the matter must be handed over to the police and the corrective course of action should take place. But with only one rider, that within the schooling system, if the perpetrator is not an adult, then others are all juveniles. Therefore, there will be the parents involved, all the stakeholders in the life of the children involved who will be called, and with the child away, a decision will be taken on the way forward. I think for the school, the prevention and making sure that the child feels safe because she has had the courage to report it will have to be really taken care of. If the perpetrator is an adult, and I think without very dispassionately, I think the matter must be handed over to the police so that corrective action is taken while the child is comforted at all other levels. It depends on who is the perpetrator.
Yes, Kanak.
Gaurav, I'll just come in with a quick comment on this as well. So what we also do, what Lataji said, what most schools actually do further on, is that we make sure that this is transparently discussed as well, because there are counselors at our schools, and it's important that children also know about it, parents also know about it. You don't want a smear campaign against a school happening. So that is also fairly important. You do not want to disturb the other kids also who might not be directly, indirectly involved with the perpetrator or the victim, but you want to make sure that, the school's image also stays protected, that the school has taken some corrective measures for this.
Okay, thank you. Ashok, the next question is for you. How do we address cases in municipal schools where there is no concept of counselors?
Good question. I mean, I think it's also a function of how much the government has invested in terms of translating the child protection policies into actionable processes in the local government and municipal schools. But with some of the resource constrained schools that we have dealt with, although I think now there are some mandatory requirements for counselors on campus, but with some of the resource constrained schools that we have worked with, which come from those communities where the school management may not have the kind of money or the resources to keep counselors in-house full-time, we do a teacher training program so that the teachers are actually equipped to kind of identify some of these signs and at least know exactly when to intervene and how to intervene. So there are a lot of good NGOs across the country. I personally work with Enfold Proactive Health Trust in Karnataka. So this NGO does a lot of this work with teachers, teacher training programs, equipping teachers with some basic skills on how to handle situations of this nature. So I think if you develop a process where you bring the teachers into confidence, I think it can still work. And that's the reason why I also say that it's important that we create an ecosystem, because unless you have the buy-in from the education department, you will not be able to reach out to all the schools out there, because the international schools are not the only schools where these incidents are likely to occur. In fact, violence is spread across communities. And the other caveat that I also want to put here is that the liability of the school is not just limited to incidents on campus only. It also comes into the picture where a member of the school administration has come across information or has reasons to believe or has an apprehension that the child in the school has been sexually abused, whether inside or outside the school. Even then, there is a mandatory reporting requirement in the eye of law. Right? So I think just working with the teachers to address some of these resource gaps is probably one way of kind of tackling the situation.
Gaurav, can I just add just a point to what Ashok had responded? He raised a very valid point. One of the things good schools do is that they don't delegate the job of counseling to counselors. It's just not schools which are resource staffed. Even the best of schools, even with abundant counseling staff, every teacher is supposed to be a counselor. So I just want that expectation to come in. It shouldn't be the case that, it's a counselor's job, a teacher is not supposed to do these things, and I happily delegate to a counselor. And by the way, those models have utterly failed around the world. The best model is that every teacher, we don't need, as much this country has to augment the infrastructure of counselors, even more important is to build in counseling capacities and skills in everyday teachers.
Thank you. The next question is, what are the guidelines for the teacher to approach such a problem initially? How can a teacher in the class look out for these kind of issues with the child? Kanak, can you answer this one?
Sure. So I think the question is that, what guidelines do teacher need to have? So what we always tell our teachers is that, maintain good talking and relationship with the student as well as the parent. It's important to know your child. It's important to know the parent as well. And it's important to know the provisions of the law. When you know that, it's, we tell our teachers, observe the child, make sure that the child is as communicative in the classroom as always. If there are any aberrations that must be reported, you must talk to them about it. Is there any issue? Because in our experience, most of the cases happen with a known person in the family or outside, someone who knows you well. And children often get threatened as well, that if you go and tell your mommy and your daddy, or if you go and complain, there is going to be some repercussion. So we tell our teachers to observe, to actually, like Vishnu was saying, that, every teacher has a responsibility of being a counselor as well. It's very important to do that, but it's also important to sort of document and monitor this process as well. So that's what we do. So I think for teachers to know this, you need to structure the process. What we've done is we've made it NEST. We talk about how natural it is, have empathy, speed up the process, keep transparency. So we have all our teachers doing that. I'll be happy to share it with any teacher who would like it, or else, you can develop a framework for yourselves as well.
Thank you. The next question is for you, Vishnu. Yes, sorry. You want to add something?
Yeah, see, I just also want to place, just to supplement what points Vishnu and Kanak kind of brought out. See, in my experience, I think no child can be 100% insulated from harmful behavior on the streets, in the school, at home. It's just not going to happen. My 13-year-old niece gets stalked every once in a while. I think it's a commonplace experience in India for boys and girls to kind of be in one kind of a dangerous situation or the other. I think the reason why I make this point is that teachers are also not immune from this unfortunate reality. So, and they also spend the maximum amount of time when the child is in campus with while in the care of the school itself. So I think the relationship that the teacher builds, there is a greater component of trust, as opposed to the counselor that you send the child to only when there is some kind of trouble to address, right? So I think it's very important to kind of understand that the responsibility is with every stakeholder around the child, the parents, the teacher, the counselor. It's a collective effort, and no one person can act in kind of like a siloed atmosphere.
Thank you. Vishnu, this is a quick question for you. As a school, how should we handle the media at the first level? as soon as we identify a POCSO case?
Gaurav, if I know the answer to this question, I'll probably build a temple. It is $1 million question, Gaurav. Reason also being, I think, the existing structure of journalism in this country, and this is not just with POCSO or anything. I feel with the pressures of economics, pressures of social media, I think even journalism is going through a serious upheaval. So I really don't know how to handle the media. Case in point, I think Kanak just mentioned, while the most publications were responsible, I know one of the leading publishers in this country in English put a very sensational headline. And we reached out to the reporter and I asked her that, why did you put this? And the reporter said, look, I did not put this. It went to the editorial board and they changed it. And after a couple of hours, she calls back and says, hey, I did not give this headline, but they had to change the headline because of the SEO string. Nowadays, the problem also is that you will have to create a headline which is sensational because it comes up in the Google search strings. Now, these are drivers or these are influences on media journalism which nobody can predict. And even a beat reporter can't do anything much. So I don't know how we can handle the media. The best what we have done is know how to consume media. That's what we tell parents. The first thing was, in fact, I wanted to respond to one of the earlier questions Kaveree had asked, what should parents do? First thing I would request parents is don't believe what media tells us. I think it is not as bad as what they claim it to be. It's not. So understand whatever you read in the media, there is a certain sense of sensational. That's a design of the industry. I'm not saying all media. I know there are a lot of wonderful journalists, and we still believe that, a lot of the good happens through journalism, but some parts of media sensation happens just through social media itself. So the best way to do is we need to learn how to consume that. And first thing first, let's not believe everything what happens on the media. A lot of things can get just sensationalized. The second thing what we want to do is be as transparent as possible to the media houses. So when they reach out to us, be as transparent as possible within the limits of ensuring that that the child is protected, the confidentiality is protected. A small mistake that a journalist could do, it can just jeopardize the entire. So I know there's one case which happened about 3 years back. I'm not going to get specifics of it. You pretty much can guess which child, because the child's society was announced, the location was announced, and the school was announced. So the society children knew that this is the child which went through it. And it was absurd. Why would you name this a child society in the first place? So some of these things, I think I also feel that be as transparent as possible to the media, but at the same time ensure that the confidential of the children are protected. As long as we stick to those, I think we will fairly be, and just hope. And I also feel that media is also evolving. I know a lot of media houses have put in internal code of conduct, which is not the case about 4 or 5 years back. Now there are fact checks. Now there are more stricter editorial controls. So I don't know an answer to your question, Gaurav. I just know that we can do internally be more disciplined in terms of how to handle media in some of these cases.
Thank
Also,
you.
one more thing, Gaurav, I'm so sorry. I know Ashok brought in a very valid point. I never expected a lawyer to tell this, is that you engage the local police station.
Yeah.
In some of this, because in our country, it is also seen in a very negative way to have a relationship with the police. I strongly advocate, Ashok. What I tell schools also the same way, please cultivate relationship with journalists in the view of educating them. A lot of journalists have no idea. They're also learning in some of these things. Part of our job is also educate journalists to say, hey, so for example, most journalists may believe, I'm not saying all, but many journalists may believe that the situation is getting worse, that the children of today are more sexually active and things are getting worse. They don't seem to realize that there's nothing has changed. In fact, we have become more Victorian than what it was. The only difference is it is getting more exposed right now. So you need to help journalists also understand the context and help them take an educator's viewpoint or a child-centric viewpoint than just a journalistic viewpoint. Sometimes the pursuit of truth is not the best solution for a child. I just want to clarify that. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is, can student redressal committee be of some use? Can quality circle time be compulsorily made a part of the timetable?
Yeah.
Kanak, can you answer this one, please?
So I feel that, quality circle time is important. I think it adds value to the child growing up, but you will need to have it as part of the school curriculum. You will need to, the POCSO Act actually makes it mandatory to have this learning happening in school. How you do it, how you have the culture integrated in the functioning of the school, that becomes very important. Whether you do it as part of the circle time, whether you do it as part of the assemblies, or you set aside time and you do it. But you need to do it not just for the legal perspective, but also for the mindset change to happen and for children to understand that this is a natural thing. So yes, absolutely, go ahead and do it with circle time, do it with your assemblies, have committees driving it at school level. Why not? 100% yes.
Kaveree, the next question is, what if sexual abuse is happening at home? The child reports to school, parent denies any such thing happening, and they say the child is lying. What does the child do, and what does the school do in such situations?
This question is for whom? Ashok or Lata?
I suppose Lataji can answer this one.
So, no, I can only say this much, that since we have had this experience of child abuse at home, and rather difficult one of the things that when we discussed it with we have to discuss it with the parents. Ultimately, after making the child feel comfortable, because the child loves to get away from home and come to school and seek guidance and comfort with either friends or with the counselors or with the teachers, each one of them who is supportive. The whole school's ecosystem will be supportive of this kid for sure, and children particularly. But, since abuse has taken place at home, it becomes very important for us to call both. And sometimes, it's very interesting that the mother lands up in school and says, please do not call the father. This is one very standard thing which we see, particularly if it's a girl child who has been abused, and it often happens that way. So they say, please do not call the father. So first we have this session, put the mother under some comfort, have some sessions with her, and then eventually we have to call the father, because the crime is perpetrated by some other elderly members or other members other than the immediate parents. Therefore, it's important for them to understand what's happening in their own home, because most of the time, either because of the working parents, both the mother and the father are away, or sometimes the father is completely kept in the dark. So we call them, speak to them, and thereafter, I remember a father asking me, do you think under these present circumstances, since I cannot do, because we have been living with this extended family situation for 2 generations, is it a good idea to send my child away to a boarding school? So solutions, these are some of the question and answers that come through, and afterwards, it becomes very difficult for the school to call that additional member of the family who has been involved in this. It is for the parents to handle it. We need to create conditions and confidence in the parents through our dialogue and instructions, maybe at times, to say that please watch the child carefully. Please do not leave the child alone at home. Please make sure that there is some elderly person all the time around, particularly after this incident and sometimes repeated incidents that take place at home. So these are some of the things that we can do. It's not too much that we can control, but I know that this child was ultimately sent to a boarding school. So, odd kind of responses happen, but maybe end of the day, we had to give up and say, okay, probably if it is safer for you to do that, please do that, and we help the child in getting an admission. I think the school, it's important to engage the families in these discussions to make sure that, like we think, that there are certain infrastructural possibilities within the school to make sure that such instances or incidences don't happen. They need to make sure that their homes are also secure for their children in many ways. They'll have to work it out themselves, but creating the ability for them to have a dialogue in their homes a little more peacefully, I think, is the help that we can render to parents and families. And also bring up these issues in PTAs and whenever a POCSO committee meets, so that, some more guidelines come, there are some more sharing that happens, and the people are finding it easier to kind of communicate and deal with it.
Dr. Lalli, can I ask you to step in here?
Can I
Yeah,
just make
sure.
one comment? Yeah.
Yeah.
See, I just want to, because a predominant part of my experience with POCSO cases has been cases of incest, and especially fathers abusing daughters has been part of my experience. So I think there are two things that I just want to make clear here. So one is, what is the objective of reporting? Prior to the POCSO Act, I think there were two objectives. One is law enforcement, and other is to injunct the offender from reoffending again. Now it is no longer a case of it's either one or two. Now the objective of the POCSO Act is to make both mandatory, which means even if there is some kind of an assurance from the family that the behavior will not repeat, the school is still under an obligation to now report it to law enforcement, number one. Number two, just to dwell very briefly into behavioral sciences, incestuous offenders are typically classified as situational sex offenders by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. There's a very beautiful paper called Child Molesters, a Behavioral Analysis. I urge everybody to read it. What that essentially means is that distance from the offender itself will probably not bring the cycle of abuse to an end, because there is the relationship that tethers the two individuals is very much alive, right? So I think what we need to understand is, perhaps as part of the training for our law enforcement, we also need to kind of educate them as to what the profile and the thinking of situational sex offenders, especially incestuous offenders, are, because it's not going to, there is no simple solution to it. Like, removing the child from the same location, because what if the child comes back for the vacations? How long will you keep the distance alive? And are you then not sending the message that, because you reported the incident, you are now being punished by being sent away, as opposed to the perpetrator being punished? Right. So I think the problem is never the children. It's always the adults in the system, right? Especially the parents. So I think a lot of effort must be made with the parents to help them understand it's not a solution for the parents to send the child away to boarding school. So that will not solve the problem.
In fact, a related question to Dr. Lalli in this is the role of parents in cover up, and really what can the counselor or the school do when such a thing happens? Dr. Lalli, you'll have to unmute yourself, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is true that in 95% of the cases, the perpetrator is known to the victim. It's someone from the family. We've had about 40,000 cases of under POCSO Act in 2018. And out of them, maximum were with the relatives. So when you have someone from within the family being the perpetrator, now we have to interpret the POCSO law with the Juvenile Justice Care and Protection Act. This child is a child in need of care and protection. Under the POCSO Act, the police, it is mandatory for the police also to inform the Child Welfare Committee within 24 hours. The Child Welfare Committee will decide in the best interest of the child, where the child obviously has to be moved then from that place, where it's not safe for the child to be at home and for the abuse to continue.
But Dr. Lalli, have you seen cases in particular of cover-up, where parents have been involved?
Cover-up does happen because there is a lot of silence. And hence this talk is important, that you have to break the silence. It's believe the child. First of all, do believe and trust what the child is saying. Hear the child. The child must have at least 5 persons that the child can trust and talk about anything at all.
Right.
And unfortunately, there are cases where the child will get removed from the school, will get any kind of a punishment also for saying that it is a make-believe. And then the cycle of abuse continues. So it is for whoever the mother or anyone that is there in the family who believes, and it's not, this is a gender neutral law, by the way. So it's not just the girls, but it's also the boys. So it's important that for the boys also, that they are believed that what they're saying is true, because the impact stays for lifelong. And that it is mandatory under the law also to report. The schools have to be very clear about that you have to report. If nothing else, please report to the child line that is there in each district. The child protection officer is there in each district. So do coordinate, do have a list of the CWC members, do have the list of child protection officers, have that on prominent display, because a number of times children feel better in terms of not just one person or the police, but in terms of talking to the counselor who is with the Child Welfare Committee.
Dr. Lalli, can I ask you a related question? How does a school deal with a scenario where the child is being sexually abused by the parent or a relative and needs to be removed physically from the situation immediately? What does the school do in such a situation?
Inform, I would say that please do inform the Child Welfare Committee also if you do not want to take that up, and there are basic principles which we say on which we decide to take the decisions for the child. The principle of the best interest of the child is the most important principle while making any decision regarding the child. So what is in the best interest of the child? Now, there have been cases which have been reported from every month one reads about it, is that the child girl has been found to be pregnant, and it's the teacher who has observed that. So it's at that point of time that either the medical authorities or the teacher, they have reported to the police that this is something that has happened. So here it is important that obviously it's then that it gets discovered that this abuse has taken place by whosoever that was.
Vishnu, may I bring you in here and talk about a question that has come in, and I think it's a concern that a lot of people have. The fake social media accounts that are made in the name of girls, it's become quite a common thing. How do you deal with such a case?
I think it's a larger issue. By the way, this fake account itself is a larger issue which is happening right now as we speak. I saw 2 or 3 people logging into our Zoom with fake accounts and creating nuisance.
Saying
I
good things.
I think it's a larger issue with respect to digital literacy and digital safety. As much as we talk about the POCSO Act, it's also important for children to understand the IT Act in itself. Some of them are cognizable offenses of what they are doing in terms of impersonating, in terms of creating. In fact, with online classes, I'm sure many school educators or parents are facing it too, that their kids are trying to impersonate, trying to put up objectionable stuff. I think children have to be made understood that there is an IT Act and you are held accountable. So you might say something in a class face to face and you're not criminally liable. But if you say the same thing online or do the same thing online, then there is an act which is applicable to you. And children don't get it. It takes some time. But we have seen that if you work with them long enough and they see some case studies, and just the way you work on sex education and POCSO, you also work on the IT Act, children do get safe technology practices. So this fake thing on girls is a symptom. It is not the cause. The underlying cause is 2 things. 1, not being able to handle technology well, and 2, not being able to handle porn well. This is not sex. There's a big distinction between sex and porn. Sex is healthy, and kids need to have a healthy relationship with sex. Porn is unrealistic. It is addictive. In fact, the parts of the region which gets ignited because of porn is not the same as part of the region that get ignited with sex. Porn, cocaine, sugar, they're all in the same parts of the brain. Which is very addictive by nature. So those are some of the things we need to work to address this fake thing around, especially around girls, for example.
Dr. Lalli, just the last question, I want to bring you in and talk about shelter homes. The situation there must be particularly dire.
Unfortunately, the shelter homes, which should be the safer places for children who have no one to be looked after, they have been found to be the most unsafe.
Absolutely.
We had series of incidences almost every year. The last was the Muzaffarnagar in Bihar, the shelter home. Where a lot of girls had been abused. The trial is still going on. Those homes come under the JJ Act, and they are the places which need to be more thoroughly inspected, which need to have more. So, of course, under the law, they have to be registered, and there has to be regular inspection of those homes in terms of how safe the children are, and greater accountability for the persons out there. And that is where the district administration, the Child Welfare Committee, and the Child Rights Commission, they have a greater role to play in. I also wanted to pick up the line on the, the pornography. Now, it's not just the safe and unsafe touch. I think schools forget about it because a lot of abuse is also the non-touch abuse. and a lot of sexual grooming is taking place.
Yeah.
So people need to be aware of the grooming practices and how they happen. And a lot of children do share sexually explicit messages, which can be playing havoc for the rest of the life. And under this act, it's important to understand that it's not just sexual assault that is covered and not just sexual harassment, but also pornographic material where you have using the child for pornographic purposes and also storing child pornography. That is an offense under this law. So even passing on WhatsApp messages which are of child pornography is an offense under this law. And
I think we can go on for a long time. I think all of us and the collective expertise of this panel has been so amazing that I do feel that we'll have to have another session where we tackle some of these questions. Especially, I thought one of the most interesting points that came through to me was the teachers as counselors. I think that point is something that really needs to be highlighted by all schools. Just to let you know that we will continue the discussion on the No Rape India pages and the Lawyers Club India pages. Thank you very much for joining me today and for sharing some really riveting experiences. I think Vishnu's experience of narrating that wonderful story, which turned out right, was very inspiring. I wish we had more such case studies. The legal expertise that Ashok brought in, Lataji's experience, vast experience, Kanak's interesting perspective from the smaller cities, and of course, Dr. Lalli's experience as a counselor. Thank you so very much. All the very best to you, and we'll see you on the other side on the pages of No Rape India and Lawyers Club India. Thank you.
Thanks, Kaveree.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kaveree. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.